So today we're going to be going over HTML and CSS, which are two of the fundamental concepts of front-end development. We have Bill on the call, who's going to be leading the workshop. If you guys have any questions, feel free to either use the Zoom chat or that channel on Slack that I talked about. And at points where we're going to ask questions for you guys, I'll be posting threads in the Slack so you can respond to those, or in the Zoom channel. Either is fine. But with that, Bill, I'll let you take it away. You want to give yourself an introduction and then get us started?
Yeah, thanks, Liam. So I'm Bill, like Liam said. I'm a developer at Code for Community. I've been here for a year now. And like Liam said, we're going to be going over today basically front-end basics, so how to get set up with creating an actual front-facing website. So there are three main languages that are going to go into this entire process, and almost every single website on the internet is going to use these three languages. So there are HTML, which you've probably heard of before, CSS, and then JavaScript. So HTML basically provides a structure to the web page. CSS is going to style the page, move things around, make things actually look nice. And then JavaScript controls the behavior of the elements on the page. Now, today we're just going to be focusing on HTML and CSS to get us started. And something to note about these languages is that they were developed a long time ago, and they've been continuously added on to since they were created in the 90s. And so these languages can have slightly inconsistent behavior across browsers. So that's just sort of something to keep in mind as we go on. But the internet is going to be a really useful resource, and I'm going to say that multiple times throughout this presentation. Basically, using Google and searching things is going to be your best friend. So the first language we're going to talk about is called Hypertext Markup Language, aka HTML. It's a very commonly known language, mainly because it is used in every single website on the internet. It is the only language of the three that we're going to learn that is absolutely required to create a website. So HTML basically just provides structure to the page. It's a subset of XML, which is basically just a syntax that we use to express certain data. So as you can see in this example here, we have a list of books, and each book has a title and an author and characters. So we can assign basically data to more data, and we can create an entire page with any sort of data, any sort of structure that we want. So it all starts with tags. Tags basically have a name and an opening and closing bracket. So as you can see here with the example tag on top, we have the opening bracket, example, and then the closing angle bracket. This is the basic structure that defines all of XML. Now, what's nice about these tags is we have an opening tag, and then after the opening tag, we have a closing tag. So you can see in this example on the bottom, the opening tag comes first, and then we can have anything we want, and then we have a closing tag. The reason this is useful is because we can put any elements inside of other elements. That's called nesting. So in this case, as you can see here, the child element would be considered a child of the example element because it's inside, it's between the opening and closing tags. And the example tag would be considered a parent of the child tag. So nesting and children is where we really get a lot of power in XML. So as you can see here on the example on the right, we can have as many children and grandchildren, whatever sort of data structure that we want, we can use with XML. Now also, if a tag has no children, if there's nothing in between the opening and closing tag, there's a shorthand that we have, you can see here at the bottom, where you just write the opening tag, the name of the element, a slash, and then the closing tag. So what this will do for us is it basically inserts the opening and the closing tag. It's just a shorthand with nothing in between. And this is going to come in use later when we look at some HTML. Now, the last thing about XML is what's called attributes. So attributes are really what make XML flexible and extensible. So basically, we can attach any data that we want to any tag that we want. So you can see here, we have the example tag again, but this time we have an attribute. So an attribute is basically made up of a name, in this case, attribute name, an equal sign, and then the value. And the value is between double quotes. So again, we can basically use this for whatever kind of data we want. So for example, if we were making a table on a page, we could specify the number of rows that that table is going to have using an attribute. And you can have as many attributes as you want on a tag. So now we're going to take a look at a few examples of XML code, specifically examples of invalid XML syntax. And so I'm going to ask you guys now to unmute your microphone if you have any thoughts, or you can pop your answer in the chat as well on why this syntax is invalid. So take a close look at the tags and try to figure out why this wouldn't really make sense on page. Yeah, so I see you guys basically getting it in chat. So you have to have a nested structure, which basically means that you have an opening tag, an opening div tag, right? And then you have a closing div tag. Now you do have a closing div tag, but the issue is you start a paragraph inside the div tag, but then you end it after the div tag. So this is invalid because every element needs to be a child of another element, or it's the root element. So here's another example. And so again, feel free to pop the answer in chat why this is going to give you an error. So there are a few things wrong with this example. Basically, it's all in this third line, the line that says custom text. So we could be going for a few things here. If we actually wanted text, just plain text, then we would get rid of the brackets and we would just write custom text. If we wanted a tag, like a custom tag, then the issue is that, well, first of all, text, then the text exclamation point makes no sense there, because you need to have, if you have a tag, a custom tag, that needs to be an attribute. Anything that comes after the tag name has to be an attribute, and this is not an attribute because it doesn't have an equal sign, doesn't have a value. And then the other issue is that there's no closing tag for a custom. Although when we're working with HTML, that per se is not always going to be an issue. And so this is the last example. So why is this one wrong?
This one's a little bit trickier.
Yes. Look closely at the syntax. So the thing about XML is that every single attribute follows the same format. So you've got an attribute name, an equal sign, and then the value of that attribute is always in between quotes. So something to keep in mind is that HTML is not a programming language technically, and it's not going to work like, for example, Java, where you have, for those of you who do know Java, where you have strings inside of quotes and then numbers or integers are just by themselves with no quotes. It's not like that in HTML. So even if we're passing in a number, we're going to need those quotes for it to be valid syntax. All right, so now that we've looked at XML, we're going to take a look at HTML. So as I said, HTML is just a subset of XML. So all that means is that all the HTML that we write is going to follow the XML syntax that we just learned. So all HTML does is it defines certain XML elements that we can use to actually create a web page. So there's lots of different HTML tags. And again, this is something where the internet is going to be your friend. Feel free after this presentation to look up whatever tags you want to look up. There are hundreds, maybe even thousands of them. Here are some of the most common examples. You're going to see these all over the place. We have a div starting in the top left, which is basically just a very simple structural unit to a page. A span, that's an inline unit. So inline just means that it stays inside the text. P is its own paragraph. We use that just to create a simple unit of text. We have H1 through H6. So basically the way this works is that H1 is the biggest, they're all headers, but H1 is the biggest header, and it goes all the way down, it gets smaller all the way to H6, and that's the smallest header. And we have A, which allows us to define a hyperlink, and this is where the attributes really come into use. So with A, we're almost always going to use the href attribute, which allows us to tell the link actually where it should link to. And then in between the opening and closing tags is going to be the actual text of that link. And then the input tag is another really common one. This is for any user input. So depending on the type attribute, it could be text input, it could be number input, a password, a button, radio, anything you want pretty much, we use the input tag for. So we'll see more examples of HTML later, but I want to move on now to CSS because CSS is really where things start to get a little fun and exciting, because CSS is how we really start to make the website pop and look nice. HTML by itself is very bland, and we'll see an example of that in a second. So we use CSS to just make it pop and make it look nice. So like I said, CSS is just used to style HTML. So all that means is that we can move elements around, right? So we can create layouts, make things bigger, smaller. We can change colors, change font sizes, stuff like that. So you can see in this example below, this is the BBC's website. And on the left is the normal website. As you might see, it looks like it's on a phone. And on the right, you have the website with the CSS stripped. So someone went in and they took out all the CSS, and you can see why CSS is so important. That site looks pretty bland, and not just unappealing to the eye, but it also looks like it's pretty difficult to navigate. And so that's why we use CSS, basically to put things where we want to put them, make them look like the way we want them to look. So this is what CSS looks like as code. You can see an example on the right. Basically, all CSS does is it defines a list of rules for the HTML elements to follow. So as you can see on the right, CSS rules are made of selectors. So those are the things in yellow. Every rule starts with a selector. And then in between the curly brackets, we have a bunch of properties and values. And then you have a semicolon to end that line. You always need semicolons to end every single line in CSS. Well, every single property in CSS, not the selectors. So as you can see here in the top, we have the P selector. On the right, we have the P selector. And then inside the brackets, we have a font size property that says 12 pixels. So in this case, we're going to select all elements that are P. So all the elements that are open bracket, P, and then close bracket. And it's going to change all of their font sizes to 12 pixels. And that's basically all CSS does. It selects any number of elements on the page. Sometimes it doesn't select any. Sometimes it selects a lot of them. And it just changes their properties. Now, just like how HTML has a lot of tags, CSS has a lot of different properties. So again, the internet's really going to be useful here in searching up some of these properties. But we'll take a look at some of the common ones in a second here. Let's first talk about selectors. So selectors, like I said, just allow you to select which elements, which HTML elements you want to follow a particular rule. So we basically have three common types of selectors, and you can see all three of them here in this example. The first one is an element selector. So this selects all input elements. So anywhere you write open bracket, input, close bracket, this rule set is going to apply to that element. Next, we have the pound sign. So the pound sign indicates an ID. So ID is just an attribute, an HTML attribute. So if you were to have element ID equals my-ID, then this rule would apply to that element. So you can see that here in the comment. It says rules apply to all tags with element ID equals my ID. So if your element looks like that, it doesn't matter what the actual tag name is. It could be an input, it could be a P, it could be an H1. As long as it has that ID, it'll follow that rule. And then the last example is a class. So class is very similar to ID. The only real essential difference is that it's called class instead of ID. So if we have any element, again, doesn't matter what it is, it could be a P, it could be a H1. If we say the class after equals my-class, then this dot selector, you can see that the dot might be a little bit difficult to see, but there's a period before my class. And so that indicates that you're selecting a class as opposed to anything else. So you might be wondering why we have all these different types of selectors. So the main reason is, again, CSS is supposed to be very flexible. You're supposed to be able to use it in a lot of different ways, but there are definitely accepted standard best practices. So how do you choose in general which selector you want to use? So in most cases, we're going to use classes. There's definitely a time and a place for element selectors, and there's definitely a time and place for ID selectors. But usually we're going to use classes because the issue with element selectors is we usually don't want to select every single element on the page. So we usually don't want to modify if we have like a lot of paragraphs on the page, for example, a lot of P tags. We don't usually want to select every single one on the page. And the issue with IDs is that IDs are supposed to be unique. So if they're not unique, that's, even though you're not actually going to really break anything, it's definitely bad practice. So the whole point of ID is that there's only one element on the page with that ID. So when you select an ID, it's only supposed to select one element. So now let's talk a little bit about specificity. So we might run into an issue in CSS where we have two rule sets that apply to the same element, right? So let's say we have an input element and we have an input selector, but we also have a class selector that applies to that element. So how is the CSS or how is the browser going to decide which rule set it's going to follow? So if the rules, so both rule sets are going to apply to that element, but if there are any rules that contradict each other, the browser is going to prefer the rule set that is that has a more specific selector. Okay, so IDs, for example, are more specific than classes. Classes are more specific than elements. It's a pretty intuitive relationship. Basically, the fewer elements you're selecting with any selector, the more specific it is. Now, if two rules have the same specificity, which really in practice shouldn't happen, you shouldn't have an issue like this, but if this were to happen, the CSS is just going to pick the rule that's defined later in the file. But again, you should try to avoid having this as an issue. So here's a fun little exercise. Basically, we have CSS on the left, our CSS code, and then on the right, we have HTML. So we have a paragraph. And so the CSS, the tricky thing here is that the CSS has a red selector, a red class selector, but it also has a paragraph selector. And so the question is, what color is this paragraph going to be? Based on what we know from specificity, what is this paragraph going to appear as? So again, feel free to leave your answers in chat. Yeah, so I see most of you getting it. It is red, and the reason why it's red is because, as I said on the last slide, class selectors are more specific than element selectors. So even though in this case the class rule set actually comes before the paragraph rule set, the class rule set is preferred simply because it's more specific. Now, if we were to get rid of that dot red in the first rule set and we just had P's, the second one, it would actually appear as blue. The second one's going to be chosen just because it's defined later in the file. So here's another example, a little more complicated this time. So we have a paragraph that has an ID of foo, and it has a class of red. It's also, I'm sorry, it's a div, it's not a paragraph. So you can see in this rule set up top, we have a div rule set, we have a red class rule set, and we have an ID rule set. Something to keep in mind with this example is that, like I said, the rules are only selected, priority specificity only really matters if rules contradict. If the rules don't contradict, then all the rules from all the rule sets are going to apply to that element. So try to guess. Again, this one's a little more complicated. You might have to really look at each line and figure out how it's affecting the div. So I think you guys are right here. So it's going to appear green. And the reason why it's going to appear green is because if you look at the ID selector that has color green, an ID of the class element and ID selectors, the ID selector is going to be the most specific one. So it's going to be green, and the font weight's going to be normal, which just means it's not bold or thin. Now, as far as the font family, the ID selector, or the ID rule set rather, doesn't tell us what font it should be. For that, we have to look at the other two selectors. Now again, the class selector is more specific than the element selector. So even though the element selector says font family Times New Roman, the class selector says font family Arial. So it's going to select Arial. So it's going to be Arial, it's going to be green, and it's going to be 24 pixels. I saw one of you mention that. It's going to be 24 pixels because you go all the way back to the element selector. Even though it's the least specific, there are no rules in the class selector or in the ID selector that contradict that font size, so it's going to keep that font size of 24 pixels. So I know that's a lot to take in. Again, if anyone has any questions, just feel free to leave them in chat. Liam will be getting to them. If I notice a question, I'll try to answer it as well. So now let's talk about CSS properties. So like I said, just like in HTML, we have a lot of tags. In CSS, we have a lot of different properties. And these properties are going to allow us to basically change HTML elements in almost any way that we want to. So they can tell HTML elements where to be, what to look like, change the color, change the size, all sorts of stuff. So here's some common CSS properties that we're going to use pretty much in every single website. So we have font size. That's pretty self-explanatory. In fact, pretty much all these names are very self-explanatory. Font size is the size of your font. Font weight is basically bold or not bold. Some fonts also allow you to go thinner than normal. So we can basically control the thickness of the font. Font style allows for italics, other sort of weird font styles that you might want to implement. Font family, as we saw in the last example, just changes the font family that is used. Border allows you to put a border around any element, so just basically an outline. And background color, also pretty self-explanatory, just allows you to specify what color the background of that element should be. So what we're going to do now is write a little bit of HTML by ourselves. You don't actually have to write it, but you should at the very least take a look at the example and really think about what the HTML is going to look like. So what we have here is we have an HTML template that I wrote for you to get you started. We have CSS on the right, and the CSS, it defines rule sets. Don't change any of the CSS. And then on the bottom, we have the desired result, basically what we want the page to look like given this CSS. So as Liam's saying in the chat, there's copy pastable code in the Slack, so follow that link and it'll take you to where you can actually mess around with it yourself. So I'll give you guys a few minutes to do that, a few minutes to play around. And again, in the meantime, anyone has questions about anything we've covered so far, feel free to leave them in the chat.
Take a couple minutes, either use the link in the Zoom chat to go to CodePen. It'll let you edit things online. It's a really useful tool, just in general, so it's good to be familiar with it. See if you can match that picture. I'll also mention now that if any of you guys are interested in following along or just reading along with this, you can do that at our learn.c4c site. As always, we have our scripts there. This might be nice for remembering any of these properties. Namely, right now we are working on trying to use the template code that we have on the screen to match the picture down at the bottom of the slide. We can check the Slack channel for week 2 to get that code in a copy and pastable format.
Something I should mention is font weight 700 is bold. We actually could write bold there instead of 700. Bold and 700 are equivalent. But usually in web design, we're going to try to use numbers because it's just a little more standardized. All right, so why doesn't everyone wrap up? See if you're using the CodePen, you can actually play around and see, and it should look exactly the same as this on the bottom. But if not, basically the answer is the first paragraph should have a class bar, because you can see the bar class has color blue and font size 20 pixels. It's a little difficult to see the font size, but that first line there that says what's up is blue and it's 20 pixels. So the first class should be bar, and inside the paragraph should just say what's up. The second paragraph is a little bit trickier because we have a span element, which again is basically just allows you to modify certain pieces of text. So the entire paragraph, if you see here, it has a green border around it. So the only rule set on the right that has a green border is the foo rule set. So we know that this paragraph has a class of foo. Another thing that tells us this is that the entire paragraph has the notorious Comic Sans font. So it's pretty easy to tell that this paragraph is foo. The tricky one, of course, is the welcome to week 2 text, which you can see is bolded. And like I said, font weight, sorry about that, font weight is bold. It's 700. So we know that the span is going to have a class of Baz because it's bold. So it's basically just like putting the pieces together. So now we're going to talk a little bit about positioning in CSS. So,
Bill, I think we have a question.
Yeah, what is it?
Oh.
So, does span only work for one-liners?
Yeah, in general, I mean, you can really make any HTML element whatever you want, but yes, we use span elements just to modify pieces of text. So again, if we want to have one part of the text that's bold, then we would use a span for that. If we want to have one part of the text that's bigger than the rest of the text, then we would use a span for that. So that's basically the job of a span.
The technical
Okay, thank
terminology
you.
is an inline element, so that it doesn't break up a paragraph.
Yeah, so inline, there's inline elements, which like Liam said, they follow the text, they don't break up the paragraph. And then we have block elements, which they are going to break up any text you have. So speaking of block elements, all the block elements are going to follow this box model. So basically every HTML element has several different boxes around it. And this looks a little bit confusing, but don't really worry. It gets pretty simple once you learn what each box is really doing. So you start with the content box, that's the innermost box, and that just contains all the children. So everything that's in between those tags takes up the content box. If there's nothing in between the tags, a lot of the time the content box is just going to be completely empty. Right outside the content box, we have the padding box. So that just includes obviously the content box plus any padding, and we'll talk about what padding is in a second. And then we have the border box. So that includes the padding box plus a border. So if you were to add a border to a particular element, usually that's only going to be 1 or 2 pixels. But if that was there, that would add 1 or 2 pixels to the size of the overall element. And then the margin box is going to be the border box plus any margin. And so margin and padding are pretty similar. And again, we'll get in a second to what those are. Basically, the main difference between margin and padding is that elements cannot share padding. So all padding is unique to a particular element, but they can share margin. So if 2 elements are right next to each other, they both have 10 pixel margin. The space between them is just going to be 10 pixels because they're sharing that 10 pixel margin. Whereas if 2 elements are right next to each other and they have 10 pixel padding, the space between them is actually going to be 20 pixels because they are not allowed to share that space. So we're going to talk a little bit about sizing HTML elements using CSS. So we have the width and the height properties. These are 2 of the most common properties in CSS, and it's pretty obvious why. They just control the size of any element. So by default, they control the size of the content box. So that's the blue box you see here, the innermost box. But if we set the box sizing to border box, then the width and height instead are going to control the size of the border box. And so going back again, that's the yellow box we see here. Now the reason we might want to do that is because it makes it a little bit easier to work with the sizes of the boxes since elements cannot share padding. And so that's why this generally is common practice today to just set box sizing to border box on all elements because it's just easier to work with. Now, all sizes need units, right? If you just were to write width 20, that doesn't make any sense because 20 what? It could be anything. So usually we'll use what's called pixels. These are just browser pixels. They're not actually pixels on your screen because obviously a desktop screen, for example, is going to have more pixels than a phone screen. So pixels in the context of CSS is a standardized unit that's supposed to look fairly similar across all browsers. So to give you an idea, 20 pixels is actually very small. That's only going to be like a couple millimeters probably on your screen. So now we have more stuff with sizing. We have the padding, the border, and the margin. So basically, these allow us to add space around the elements. And we want to do that because we don't want everything to look super compact and right next to each other. We want to give things space. So again, padding is space that can't be shared with other elements. Border is just a border. Again, usually it's just going to be 1 or 2 pixels. Sometimes there's no, most of the time there's no border. And then margin is shared space around the elements. So if we were to say set padding to 20 pixels, that is going to make the padding box 20 extra pixels on each side. So if we have, going back to this box here, if we have the content box, let's say the content box is 20 pixels wide, and we add 20 pixels of padding, there's going to be 20 pixels on the left, 20 pixels on the top, 20 pixels on the right, and 20 pixels on the bottom, because it wraps all the way around the box. Now, we can also use left and top with a dash as a suffix to add space only to one side. So if we just wanted, say, a border on top, we could write border dash top. If we just want padding on the left, we can write padding dash left. And yeah, we can do that with left, top, bottom, right, anything we want. So now we're going to do a little exercise. Basically, I give you box rule set. So imagine a box that just follows this rule set, and I have the box model here on the right as a reference. So it has a width of 50 pixels, it has padding 10 pixels, a border of 2 pixels, the color and the solid don't affect anything, it's just 2 pixels, and a margin left of 8 pixels. Now keep in mind, what I want you guys to do is try to figure out how wide this box is going to end up being, the total width of the margin box. So something to keep in mind here is that, as I said with the padding example, these attributes are going to add space on all sides because the boxes wrap around each other, unless otherwise specified, as in the margin left. So if you guys have answers, feel free to throw them in chat, and we'll go over it in just a second.
A couple minutes. No one else feeling like doing math today? Go, you got 2 answers, 3.
Oh, we have a lot of disagreement. So, drum roll, the correct answer is 82. And I think I saw a couple of 90s in chat, and I think how you're getting the 90 is by adding the extra margin. So keep in mind that margin left is only going to be on one side. It's only going to be on the left side. So the right side is not going to have any margin. So basically, the way we figure out this 82 is we start with the width of the content box. So that's 50 pixels, plus 10 pixels on each side. So 50 plus 10 plus 10, that's 70. Plus 2 pixels of border on each side, so that brings us up to 74, and plus 8 pixels only on the left side, so that gets us 82. So now we're going to talk about page layouts in CSS. This is a slightly more advanced topic, and it can be frustrating even for seasoned developers, mainly because when we're designing layouts in CSS, we want these layouts to look good on all devices. So whether we have a phone, which is a very narrow and tall screen, or if we have a desktop, which is a much wider screen, we want the website to look good no matter what device it's on. And so that's why designing layouts that's called responsive. So a responsive layout is going to look good on pretty much any device. So designing responsive layouts is one of the most difficult things about CSS. But fortunately, we have 2 systems in CSS that are going to help us out with this. And they're called Grid and Flexbox. So we'll start with Grid. As you might expect, Grid is just a grid. It allows us to define areas on the web page, basically like rows and columns. Although you don't actually see the rows and columns necessarily, they are there. And this is helpful. We'll see an example of this later when we do the demo. And this is helpful because it gives us clear boundaries for where things should be on the page. So as you can see here, we have mobile, tablet, and desktop. And we have a grid that basically we can put elements on different parts of the grid depending on which device we have. Now again, this is slightly more advanced CSS, but it's useful to just have an idea for now. Yeah, like Liam said in chat, layout can get pretty advanced, so we're going to be providing you with a lot of the layout code, and you'll see in the demo as well. So the other useful system that we have for layouts is Flexbox. So Flexbox is a little simpler than Grid. You can think of Flexbox as just like a row of Grid. It basically just lays out elements horizontally or vertically. It doesn't state exactly where these elements should start and end, so that's the main difference between Flexbox and a grid. With a grid, we tell each element you start here, you end here. With Flexbox, we just kind of have a bunch of elements laid out either horizontally or vertically. But Flexbox also allows us to mess with the spacing a little bit, stuff like that, and again, we'll see examples of that. Flexbox is very useful for making horizontal and vertical lists. So if we just have list element after element after element, we'll typically use a Flexbox for that. And again, we'll see examples of both of these in the demo. All right, so speaking of the demo, let's get into it. So there is a code pen. Liam has a link to it. You just put it in chat. And it should start out looking like this. So this is basically the layout that I wrote just to get us started. Very simple layout. So basically, I'm going to go over how I've created this layout, and then we're going to mess around with a little CSS after, so you can really see how it works. And I really strongly recommend you guys follow along to get some hands-on experience. It's going to be very useful because this week you're going to be messing around with HTML and CSS yourself. And so it's going to be useful to have that hands-on experience now. So with that being said, hopefully you guys have all opened it by now and you see it. Let us know in chat if you have any issues with that or if you don't see the code. And you can go ahead and minimize this JS screen. Obviously, that's for JavaScript, and we're not going to be using any JavaScript right now. So we're just going to be focusing on the HTML and the CSS. So looking over at the HTML, we have actually, it's pretty much all divs. And the reason why we use so many divs is because, again, a div is just a basic structural unit in HTML. That's just how we create like a block, one thing, if you will, on the page. So we have the entire page is wrapped in this first div that has a class of main, right? Actually, let's start with the body first. So the body is a rule set that applies to the entire body of the page, which is basically an imaginary element that sits right, that wraps everything. So if you imagine like a body, an opening body tag here and a closing body tag here, which is what we would normally have, but we don't actually need to write it in this case. So we're using this body basically to set rules for all of the elements on the page. So we set the background to white. We actually don't technically need this because the background's white by default. We have a margin of 0. So you see if we delete this margin 0, it's very difficult to see, but there will be a very tiny, just like a few pixel margin around the outside, and we don't want that, so we're going to set margin to 0. And then the font family, we're going to set to Arial. So that's just better. By default, if we were to delete this, it'll appear as Times New Roman, as you can see there. And I think Arial looks a little bit better, so we're going to stick with Arial for now. Then, as I was saying before, we have this main div. Now, the reason we have this main div is it basically creates the entire layout for us. So we see this first property says display grid. So this is how we actually use a grid. We need an element, a wrapper element, in this case the main div, that has this property, display grid. And basically this will create a grid for us. Now, how we actually use a grid is we define spaces for rows and columns. So you can see this property here, grid template rows, is going to define our rows. Now, all that auto means here is that we have 2 rows. We have 2 rows because there's 2 autos. If we added another auto, there would be 3 rows. Pretty self-explanatory. So the reason why we say auto here is because auto is basically in CSS just means figure it out for me. Just do the work for me. I don't want to tell you. I don't really care exactly how big it is. Just, you know, do it for me. And usually the CSS, the browser will take care of that for you. The reason why we say that in this case is because the rows, so we basically have two rows. We have this top bar. You can see my blog. The background is gray. That's the first row. And then everything below that is the second row. I see, can we add comments to our codes so we know what each part does? Absolutely, feel free to add anything you guys want. In HTML, just so you guys know, the code syntax is like this. Sorry, the comment syntax is like this. So it's open bracket, exclamation point, dash, dash, comment, and then the closing, dash, dash, and closing bracket. And then in CSS, we have slash, asterisk, comment, slash, asterisk. That gets us a comment. But yeah, I strongly encourage you actually to add comments because that helps you sort of, you know, annotate your code so you know what each thing is doing. The only other thing in main is we have a row gap, and that just defines, in this case, 20 pixels of space between the rows. So we have the first row, 20 pixels of space, and the second row. And I actually skipped right over the columns, which is very similar to rows, except of course it's columns. Now in this case, we have 80% and 20%. So again, because there's two values here, that means that we have two columns. Now look what happens if I were to make three columns, 80%, 10%, 10%. Look what happens here. There's an extra 10% of the page is a third column that's not used. So we're going to keep it as 80%, 20%. So that means that this part here, this left part of the page takes up 80%, and the right part takes up 20%.
So there's a couple more layout things in the rest of the file, but I think in the interest of time, maybe Bill, if we can walk through kind of styling of a button and just kind of showing like how we would add a new element and kind of style it up, that might be
sure.
Useful. So
let's say we want to add buttons to the top bar here. Right, so this is all inside the nav bar class. You can see this has a background of gray, EE is gray. So that's this whole area here on top. So we have the H1. So again, if we were to make this H5, it would appear smaller. We keep it as H1 because we want it to be big. And we can add anything we want in here, but let's do a button because we want to add a button. So let's call this about. And you can see there, that's a pretty ugly button. It's the default appearance of a button. So if we want to make this button look a little bit better, we can simply add a rule set for buttons. So this is going to apply to every single button on the page. So no matter where you put a button on the page, this rule set is going to apply to it. So we can start by, let's say we want the background not to be that weird gradient, that default gradient. Let's say we just want it to be gray. So we can set it to gray. You can see it actually looks even uglier now. That's mainly because the color is black and the background is gray. That doesn't work very nice. So we can set the color to white. And so now we set the color to white and the button appears white. Now it's very difficult to see. I doubt you guys can see it, but there's a tiny border around that button. So what we can do, that's the default behavior. It's not because I set a border, it's just the default behavior of browsers. So we set border to none, and that'll get rid of the border for us. Now, this button's very small, right? It's very difficult to click. So there are a few things we can do to help that. First of all, we can increase the font size, just make it appear a little bit bigger, make the text appear a little bit bigger. But even then, the button still looks weird because the border ends right outside of the text. So this is where padding comes into use. So again, padding just allows us to get a little bit of space around the text. So if we were to set padding to 10 pixels, that's going to add 10 pixels around all the text. Now, let's say we wanted to add margin. So as you can see, margin has a very different effect from padding. And the reason why is because margin is outside of the border box, and the background only goes up to the border box. So padding, whereas padding is going to add more background, margin is not. All margin is going to do, if you look closely at the button here, all margin does is it gives it space on every side, so you can see it just, the button's basically just asking for more space around it. So that's spacing. There are a couple other fun things you can do, and again, the properties are endless. I encourage you to look these up. We can change the cursor, so if we want this button to have, you know, like a link cursor when you mouse over it, we can do that. We can do a bunch of other things. We can do shadows. We can change the font weight, as you saw in some of the examples. That's going to make it bold. All sorts of fun stuff like that. Now, here's the thing. We don't want every single button to look like this, right? We really only want the buttons in the top part here to look like that. So what we're going to do in that case is we're going to add a class. So this way we can just select the buttons that are in our nav bar. Now, an important thing in CSS is having good class names. Well, I guess it's technically HTML, but HTML and CSS, it's really important to have good class names because CSS can get very unwieldy. I mean, you can already see here, it's basically just a list of rules. So if you have really weird and undescriptive names, the rules are going to get really hard to read and manage. So you want to make sure that you have a very consistent sort of naming scheme so that you know which rules apply to which thing. So here you can see in the structure, right, we have a nav bar. Inside the nav bar, we have a nav bar logo, and actually these buttons should go outside of the logo, right? They should go there. That way they appear next to the header. And so yeah, we can add as many buttons as we want, and we keep this navbar button class, so all of them are going to look the same. And we have a few more minutes here, so I'm going to do a little bit on Flexbox. So we have an article list down here that's not really used. So you can see if we have any text here, it's going to pop up right here. What we can do is add, let's say we want to add an article. So we'll call this article list item. Again, we want to follow this naming scheme so that we know what each class is supposed to do. And what we can do is define an article list item class. So basically, we want each item. So let's put two items here. Call this article 1 and article 2. And so you can see here they both pop up, but that doesn't really look much like a blog, right? We want to give these things some space, maybe a border, whatever we want, right? So let's start with some simple things just like we did with the buttons. We'll set some padding, so we'll say padding 10 pixels. That's going to give us a little bit of space. We'll set a border. So 1 pixel is the width of the border. Solid just means it's solid, as opposed to you could do dashed, but that just kind of looks weird. So we will almost always use solid. And then you can set the color. If you want it to be blue, it'll be blue. If you want custom colors, by the way, HTML uses hex colors. If you want a hex color picker, just literally Google hex color picker and it'll show up. And you can make any color you want. And let's say we want to add a little bit of margin, but we don't want to add margin to all sides, because then if we add margin to all sides, you see the article gets pushed to the right a little bit. So instead of doing that, we're going to add margin only to the bottom. So this way we give space between the articles without putting any space on the left. All right? And again, that's just basic spacing stuff. Now to talk a little bit about Flex, you see here we have the article list, which occupies a certain space in the grid, and again, I really encourage you to look this over in your own time because it's going to be very helpful. There's a lot of great guides out there on using grid. As far as Flex goes, Flex is a lot simpler. We just use display Flex. So if you remember with the grid, we had display grid. With a Flexbox, we have display Flex. And then flex direction column tells us that these boxes should be ordered like a column instead of like a row. If we were to delete this, you'll see the articles will appear next to each other. We don't want that. We want them to be vertical. So we set flex direction to column. That makes them appear one on top of another. And that's basically all there is essentially to Flexbox. Obviously, there's a lot of other stuff. If we were to, so let's say we were to have it as a row. Let's say we want to add a little space. We can use the justify content property, and we can say space between, and that's going to put a lot of space between, right? Or we could do space around, and that's going to put a lot of space around elements. Space evenly. You get the idea. We can do just left. That puts everything on the left. That's by default. Right. That puts everything on the right, and so on and so forth. So that's basically, again, I mean, we could spend days going on about all the CSS properties that there are. The internet is your friend. Google is your friend. Whenever you have questions, just search them up. I promise you there will be a question that is exactly what you're looking for somewhere on the internet. And usually it's the first 1 or 2 results. So with that said, I mean, that's basically it to today's presentation. And yeah, like Sadaf just said in the chat, please give us feedback. We're trying to figure out the best way to sort of help you guys build this website yourself. And so yeah, so that's it for this presentation. I hope you guys learned enough about HTML and CSS in an hour to really get you going. And I'm not sure if Liam, have you told them about the assignment yet?
Yeah. Thank you, Bill. It was a fantastic workshop, great presentation. So for everyone right now, I'm going to be sending out another CodePen link, which is just Bill's more fleshed out blog, which will be very similar to the assignment that we're doing this week. So it'll be good to have that as an example. Feel free to use it. The very nice thing about CodePen is that you can mess around with this, and the best way of learning these technologies is really just by messing around, like having it in front of you and trying to design these things. So then later today, we'll be sending out our assignment for the week, which will be basically building out some static home pages for our eventual blog project that we're all going to work on throughout this semester. And that will be using a lot of HTML and CSS. We have a lot of starter code for you with some in-depth comments. The last thing I'll mention, like Bill said, Google is going to be your friend here. We also, at our learn.c4cneu.com site, we have a typed script of every concept that we went through, which has a lot of links to resources. So if you are confused or looking for a right property or why something isn't coming out the right way, you can use that. We're also always available through Slack, so you can always ask questions there. We'll be ready to help. So with that, I think thank you all for coming. Connor, was there anything else I missed, or?
Yeah, just one quick thing. Hey, Bill, could you go back to the feedback form on the slides real quick, just so everyone can get a chance to fill it out?
Oh yeah, sure.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, so basically this weekend, or for the remaining week, I guess, we'll be sending out, as Liam said, a care package, just containing some directions and a bunch of like helpful stuff for you to start building out like the homepage of your website. So again, if you have any questions, yeah, just let us know in the Jumpstart channel or use Google. Google is your friend. That's all I have. So
Thank you guys for coming.